Okay, we are alive. So, welcome everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. No matter your time zone, we're all arriving right on time for this shared moment of learning and connection. It is truly a joy to welcome you to this meeting and together once more as a community committed to nurturing thoughtful, practice, and process-oriented research across Latin America and beyond. Let me begin with a brief introduction. The research clinics were created with a simple but powerful purpose to offer a supportive space where researchers can share work in progress, receive generous and constructive feedback, and grow together. These clinics are not only about strengthening extended abstracts, it's about strengthening people, ideas, and conversations that matter. The clinics are a place where curiosity meets mentorship and where early stage thinking can flourish with guidance and care. This initiative continues the spirit of our previous Latin American Practice and Process gathering in 2024 in Medellin, Colombia, an event that reminded us how vibrant, creative, and essential our regional scholarly community is. Today's session carries the same energy of connection, exchange, and collective learning. A short word about LAPP. Our community exists to amplify Latin American voices in practice and process scholarship, to build bridges across institutions and countries, and to create opportunities for collaboration and intellectual companionship. We have built the LAPP with the support of our European mentors who help us reflect on how to honor the unique aspects of Latin America and bring them meaningfully into the international community through a continuously decolonial perspective. Through webinars, workshops, and clinics like this one, we work to cultivate a network where knowledge is shared generously and every contribution is valued. Before we begin, I want to pause and express heartfelt thanks to all you authors who submitted your extended abstracts. Thank you for your commitment and openness to feedback. And to the faculty, mentors, organizers, and facilitators join us today. Thank you for the time, care, and insight you offer so generously. Your contributions are what make this space meaningful. I invite you all to enter this session with warmth, curiosity, and the spirit of collaboration. May today's conversations inspire you, challenge you, and support you in taking the next steps in your research journey. Welcome, and let's begin our time together. Now, I would like to invite Eduardo Villar to jump in. Eduardo, please.
Thank you, Poliana. I would try to share my slides. I'm in charge to make a brief introduction of our community in Latin America. So I think I can say I always started with a Brazilian caipirinha. In 2003, we have Richard Wichton join us for Ibero-American Academy of Management conference in São Paulo. And at that time, we didn't have clear the practice based studies in Latin America and also SIP, but he, as an institutionalist, brought some ideas that somehow near the 2004 was published in our main journal in Brazil and perhaps Latin America as well, that it's high, that it's a journal for management enterprises. So we have 3 papers from SAP published in Portuguese, so it was very important for stimulate the ideas here. And we did some small study about how it was, why it started in Brazil, besides all countries in Latin America. So first of all, we had already some scholars back to the 90s working with sociological approaches to organizational studies and strategy. So these scholars somehow saw an opportunity to internationalize their research with this idea of strategic practice or practice-based studies, mainly because we have a normative institution of postgraduate programs in Brazil that did some pressure for internationalization of the programs. So they somehow was invited to join more broad research groups. And we also have very early in the development of SAP, the one course in 2006 in Paraná at PUC, offered by Paulo Mussi. But most of them, there were scholars that already had some long trajectory of research. And so the commitment of the radical agenda of practice-based studies in SAP was somehow not fully comprehended at this time. After 2010, so we saw some scholars that did their thesis based on these approaches. So we have, for instance, Rosalia Lavada that went to Spain, Marcelo Bispo that went to Italy. We had Maria Elisa Brandão that went to Canada, and many others that I could cite here. But I think that they taken more seriously the ontological and theoretical approaches of practice and process for their research. Also, we have somehow they consolidated this practice track at the Brazilian Academy of Management, that it's Ampari. Since 2017, we have holded a track on this issue. So it changed the conveners, it changed the names, but we every 3 years we have some group holding it. And we also joined in 2003 the Brazilian Society for Organizational Studies with a team on communication, strategizing communication. And since 2003 as well, we are working side by side with Colombia, especially EAFIT Scholar, with the development of this community. So here we have some pictures of previous encounters. We have the Brazilian Society of Organizational Studies Conference in 2004. We have the first in-person meeting with Marta. She came to Brazil in March 2004 for 1 week of activities in UFPR in Paraná. And also our annual meeting at Brazilian Academy of Management. Last year, we had Sherazade Abdallah from Canada as a keynote speaker. And then we have our LAPPG that basically was created and bring to being from zero from EAFIT scholars. In December, we had more or less 50 participants among students, scholars, that went to Colombia to discuss and to join this community. Also, in 2025, we have many activities. I could not cover it in one slide, but I think I can say in the Brazilian Academy of Management, we have now two tracks on this issue, one of open strategy and other of strategic practice. We have representatives at SMS. So Marta just finished her term, but Maria Andrea de Villa was recently elected to keep the spot. Also, we have Rosalia elected for as representative at large at AOM, and Marcelo is being a convener at Eagles this year, but also 2026, bringing approaches of practice studies representing Latin America. And we have our entry at the encyclopedia when we are trying to develop how SAP is being developed in South America. It might be published in December this year or January next year. So it's really close of a final publication. And the most important, we have already the organized and have set the data for the second Latin American Practice and Process Gathering Conference that it will be in São Paulo at Mackenzie University, 2026, from the 2nd to 4th of December. So save the date. We have already many well-known, worldwide recognized scholars that are making a big effort to join us in São Paulo. So you have many names as the ones you can see in the slide, and many others still to confirm. And the final slide, I would just remember why we are here and why to join this community and why to join the conference as well. First of all, we are very inclusive in terms of language. So, as you can see, we can speak Portuguese, Spanish, and poor English, but we can. So we are very inclusive of the language you can participate in the community. Also, as Poliana says, we have many activities. So you have the international keynote speakers, but we have clinics to give feedback. We have methodological workshops. Who participated in 2024 had the opportunity to have brilliant workshops with Anne Langley about process theorizing. We have this we sit side by side with these big, well-known and recognized academics from around the world in the conference, and also a hub for networking, for co-authorship, scholarship, and in general cross-regional partnerships. And also, something is very important for us. We are very democratic and inclusive about the team you are studying. Since you are interested in practice and process approaches, you can join us. So no matter if you are studying leadership, entrepreneurship, strategy, organizational studies, what else, if you are interested in the approach, you are very welcome in our community. So the invitation is done. We hope everyone that is in this room can join us and participate in our conference in 2026. Poliana, I give you back the word. Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. Now I'm going to ask Heiko. Is he okay? But first, let me just share a very important news today. Sylvia, happy birthday. It's your birthday, but the gift is ours from your presence here. Thank you so much for this, Sylvia.
Happy birthday.
Happy
Feliz
birthday, Sierra.
cumpleaños.
It's my pleasure.
Auguri,
It's my
tanto auguri.
pleasure. Grazie, grazie. It's nice to celebrate my birthday with you. It's an honor. It's like having a party all together, a remote party. Thanks so much, Poliana. Very kind of you, sweetheart.
You, Silvia, for joining us on this day. Um, my my intervention is going to be really quick. I just want to add on to some points that Eduardo mentioned. We started this gathering and we started talking to each other as a community when we realized there were multiple people in Latin America doing practice and process research, and we had not read or cited each other. I always, when I engage with strategy as practice scholars, I always remind them that Rosalia wrote the first strategy as practice articles in 2006. And I think many scholars in the global north do not necessarily know that work. And it might be because it's written in Portuguese. But many scholars in Latin America and South America, we did also not know our work, and we did not read or cite each other or invite each other as reviewers. And I think that this is something that we have corrected and that we're still working to correct even more strongly. And one of the initiatives we have in this sense is a call for papers in Innovar. And we have mentioned this over the last year, and we have extended the deadline until the 31st of January. It is very ample in scope in the sense that we accept practice and process approaches in, as Eduardo mentioned, any number of subfields of management and organization studies, many different ontological positions from practice and process approaches. We only ask for a specific relationship to Latin America. And I believe that this is a very, I hope it is a rallying flag which kind of transcends the Portuguese-Spanish boundary, because we accept publications in Portuguese, in Spanish, and in English. And in that sense, we hope that this provides a space for all of us, all of you, to help put a rallying flag in the ground and say, this is work we are doing from Latin America. These are other people on the Latin American map of practice and process researchers, no matter whether they are in more strategy or more towards entrepreneurship or responsible management as practice. So I just wanted to highlight this. And as I have put both the link and the e-card in the chat, and we have extended this deadline until the 31st of January. And I'd be really happy to see many contributions that you still have, that you're still working on. We'd be delighted to have them. Thank you. That's it. Very short one.
Well, thank you, Heiko. For now, we're gonna start a little bit for introduction of our lecture for today. So I'm gonna introduce Pedro, that besides is an inspiring friend, is someone who creates the space in generosity, curiosity, and real thoughtful conversation. He reminds us that scholarship is not only about ideas, but about people who helps us to think better together. So his work connects theory and practice in a very grounded way, always looking at what happens in everyday organizational life, the interactions, negotiations, and expertise that people build as they go. This has everything to do with the spirit of this meeting today, where practice, process, and community meet. So Pedro is an assistant professor at Copenhagen Business School. He studies how organizations recognize expertise and how bureaucracy works or sometimes doesn't work. and recognizing the real settings. So he's also a co-founder of Talking About Organizations podcast and is a member of Ethnography Atelier, two great initiatives that help a lot of scholars and students, including myself, engaging more deeply and with organizational theory and qualitative methods. So just remember everyone that after his talk, we're gonna open a little bit of the Q&A. So feel free to bring some questions and join and jump in the conversation. Please join me. Welcome Pedro Monteiro. Pedro, please, the forum is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fabrizio. I'm going to share my slides. Hopefully this is going to work. Yeah, can you see it and hear me well? Great.
Yes, Pedro.
Yes.
Great. So thank you, Fabrizio, Poliana, Heiko, Eduardo, and everyone else who is here, including Silvia, who is celebrating the birthday with us. And thank you for the chance for sharing these ideas. So since this is a research clinic, I thought about making this presentation as a working in progress or sharing a working in progress idea that I've been developing with a colleague. And I really much welcome your comments. I'm going to speak for like 30 minutes, and it's my understanding that we have other 30 minutes to just, debate and talk. So the title is Inverting the Map, Practice for a Global Inquiry. And as you can see here in the map, what I'm trying to do is to literally, I think, invert some assumptions in the way social science has developed and works. I think that it goes back to what Poliana was saying, that the spirit of this community seems to be one of decolonial exchanges. It's not always the values and practices in the broader field, right? So I think I'm speaking more to the broader field. And I imagine that many of the things that I'm going to say here, many of you take for granted, right? Because it's just what people do in such a community. But I'm speaking to the people beyond this space somehow. And in trying to think, how can we achieve this goal? So I'm working on the how, as most practice people do, in making theories and theorizing in ways that is more plural, that is more respectful, that maybe is more responsible, that captures and channels the insights from phenomena, experiences, theories from the global south in relation to the north. And this is joint work I have been developing with my co-author Anna Kim. Anna is originally from South Korea, and she's at McGill, and she has done a lot of research in Africa, and also currently in indigenous populations in Canada. And, we got talking about her experience. I'm originally from Brazil, and I did fieldwork in Brazil on how we see the experience of debating with other people, trying to theorize this phenomena, and the reaction we get from reviewers, editors, and so on. And thinking about how can we think about methodological approaches that we can honor the context, the people, and try to engage South-North in a way that we think is more decolonial, respectful, and so on. So this is, part reflecting some conversations with her and our joint paper on this. And also I need to do another caveat that when I'm talking about global inquiry, I'm talking about, in particular, qualitative theory building, research in management, right? So that's my scope. There are many ways of doing research. There are many fields I am working and speaking with this community here. Okay, so here's the outline on what I want to share with you today. I have a bit of a big preamble in which I'm going to tell a story you are very familiar with, but it's going to be important to help me think through some of the problems, practices, and principles for global inquiry. That is the meat of the presentation. And then, as I said, we have the Q&A. So the preamble is the following. The discovery of America. I'm sure you're all familiar with this story. I thought it would be, fitting for our event. And I'm going to tell you first the version of this story as I heard when I was a student in high school and middle school in Brazil, right? And then I have a second version of this. So the first one, the story I heard when I was a student reading the history books was that at some point the Europeans arrived, right? And they were the ones that wrote this story. What was told to me was that the indigenous people did not have a real history because they didn't write things down, right? So there was something different in the encounter here already. And there was the usual tale of the caravels that came from Portugal and landed, and the famous Pero Vaz de Caminha, who is the person who wrote the first letter back to the king and telling in writing what was happening, being the historical artifact of what was happening there. Then, as Europeans settled, they embarked in this civilizing mission into trying to bring Christianity and values to these people that they saw as in a different stage of development, right? They were naked, they were clothed, they had many gods, they had one, and this is the painting for a first mass that took place in Brazil. You can see already this idea represented, I think, visually here. And of course, there were many tales about this exotic land and people that did things like eating other people, right? There was a story about a priest that had been eaten alive and so on by the Tupinambá, which is a population in Brazil. And probably as I'm telling this story, some of you are contorting on the chair because, there is an alternative view that I hope people learn now in high school. That was the one I learned, but I'm sure that nowadays I hope that the books are written a different way. But of course, as I have read more, you see this alternative, right? Which is one that was not really a discovery, but maybe more an invasion or an arrival, right? Because as we know, people were already here with a lot of worldviews and histories. I just have the example here of the Aztec Codex, right? With all sorts of knowledge, complex societies spanning large territories, a vastity of languages, and so on. It's stuff that was more visible, I think, among some of these populations. But I think that more current, modern archaeological research more and more discovers, or at least puts more evidence to what we always knew somehow about the complexity of the societies and the achievements that they had. I just have a couple of examples here, right, from science and nature, exactly showing that with new techniques, they can show that in the Amazon, what is hard to see under the forest, there was a lot of work, roads, and all sorts of man-made, or I should say human-made constructions, right, that made possible all the sharing, the trade routes, and on and on and on. So this has been shown and shown and shown and shown. I think that hopefully by now the history books are taking in consideration that. And of course, importantly, and I think maybe this is still emerging more, that this encounter is part of a large history of exchanges, right? The example here on the left is a map that showcases both the European and the more Mesoamerican ways of depicting and showing land and so on. And there is this interesting book that came out, I think, last year by Caroline Pennock that talks about the discovery of the people from the indigenous populations in Europe, all the people that went there, both nobility, of course, and people that were forced, but also all sort of representatives of the different lands and populations and tribes and so on. On how this exchange really went both ways, and there was a lot of of course a lot of domination and violence, but to some extent also this other side of the story that is rarely told, right? So I'm telling this story because I wanted to make a parallel from a geographic to a social exploration, and from something that is so wildly debated and told, something that is very niche, which is our own world, right? Because we are part of a very niche part of the social world, which is people that are interested in understanding social processes, and more specifically, organization and management processes, right? And in this land, I see a lot of discovery. I put this in quotation marks of the global south. Again, it's not these people in this call for sure, but if you just zoom out and look around, I just have some examples about, there are conferences for people that study emerging markets. That is a special issue at Org Science. There is, essays being written about people sometimes called developing places or global south, or whatever it is, right? So there is this debate, which of course, on the surface, I am very happy to see that there is such interest, right? When I had said that I was going to do fieldwork in Brazil and I was studying in the UK, some people were slightly apprehensive. Not my mentor, of course, but just other people, because was this going to be interesting, and you are based in the UK and whatever. So I'm very glad to see such interest. But I think that there are a few things that are missing in this debate, and that's why I put the discovery in quotation marks. One is that this is not entirely new, that the social science have always been entangled in South and North relationships. And I just have two examples here. One is, I'm sure that many of us may have taught, or at least once talked about, the concept of bureaucracy by Weber, right? It's kind of, the foundation for a course on introduction to management. And we know that Weber, or we should say the Webers, because it was a couple, arrived at that conceptualization through a lot of comparative work, right? Including about the global south, like China and so on. And there is literature showing exactly that how much in the conceptualization of capitalism or bureaucratic administration, there is all of this at the on the rooting of all of that, right? And I have another example here of one maybe that is the most cited social scientist, Foucault, at least that's what I understand to be, who has lived and worked in Tunisia, and historical work shows that that experience was foundation for his conceptualization of power and many other things, right? So, in a way, these interactions and exchanges have taken place at the very roots of social science. But I think what is interesting yesterday and today is that often the global south is limited to sources of raw data, at least explicitly in the recognition of what is being conceptualized, not so much theories. One example here is, again, a widely debated case, Bourdieu, which has been also, let's say, criticized, not just for ignoring literature and scholarship of the global south, but a lot about feminist theorizing as well in his own work about gender, that many people have shown that, so it goes beyond colonial relations. But I have just one example here in a paper that I think drives the home very well, which is the work of Rowan Connell, in which she reads work from Bourdieu and Giddens in a colonial way, and shows that while someone like Bourdieu engaged, again, he was also involved, in this case in Algeria, right, living there, working there, involved even in the liberation movement and so on, and was influenced by that. Never really, for example, cited work of people like Frantz Fanon, right, that came out at the same time in which he was working and so on, right? So ignored all of that. So, and I think that some of this still remains, and I'm going to get back to this in a second. And the other point, and maybe the more, of course, complex, delicate, heart-wrenching one, is that a lot of theorizing yesterday and today has a lot of stereotypes, essentialist representations, and general epistemic harm towards those populations. There is another great, I think, article by Connell in which he goes and revisits classical social theory, and she shows that while we have a narrative that sociology emerged out of industrialization, political movements, she says that actually at the root is empire, and this idea in which the theorists were trying to understand European civilization, later American civilization, in light of the rest of the world, and which was seen as very much the other, right? And after seen as less refined, civilized, and so on and so forth. And I think the extreme maybe example of how some of these things I think color some of this stuff is the human zoos that existed. And that is the photo I have here of a human zoo in Paris from last century, right? Nowadays, we wouldn't see anything remotely like this, both conceptually or in practice. But my point is that some of this lives on, and that's what I'm going to show. But at this point, I just wanted to, say something that I'm being particularly negative so far, but my guiding principle here is the idea that Gramsci is famous for using pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will, right? So, this is kind of what I think as the status quo, but I think that my work with Anna and others is exactly about thinking, okay, so what then, right? And that's exactly what I'm going to sink my teeth in now, which is trying to identify some of these problems, naming them, and pointing to them, but also some principles that I think can help us address them as we produce research. And there are three key ones that are key problems: universalization, cultural superiority, and exoticism, which I have mirrored with principles that I think can help address that: particularizing, symmetrizing, and contextualizing. And I'm going to go one by one with details here now, right? But just to understand, that is the logic of my main argument, that we see that in both the calls and the interest and published research on the Global South, some of these things exist and they have been widely debated. We are not the first by far to say any of this. I think what we try to do is try to arrange a lot of different debates together into a framework that is parsimonious and identify three problems and offers principles to address them. And of course, in the full paper, we go much more in details about how this can inspire ways of collecting data, analyzing data, writing about data, and so on. Here, I'm going to be a bit more light touch on that because I wanted to, give space for the debate later, right? But the idea here is to identify the problems, how to address them, all the way down to strategies in the actual work. So first thing, universalization and particularizing. By universalization, we mean the uncritical generalization and censoring of global north experiences, categories, and theories as they're valid by default across the world, right? So taking something that is specific, like the Weberian conceptualization of bureaucracy, and saying that it necessarily applies, by default around the world. Of course, all concepts and theories are relevant, and it's our job to try to see when and how they are relevant. But the point here is that assume that that is kind of some form of norm, right? Which is rooted in colonialism that has installed, ways of managing or knowing as the unmarked, as the normal, rendering others invisible. I'm drawing here a lot with the idea from the thought by Eduardo Ibarra Colado, which was the topic of one podcast episode in the Talking About Organizations podcast that Fabrizio mentioned, right? So if you're curious, we go more into detail there. But I think that this is very visible in scholarship when you see exactly what I just mentioned before, that many times the Global South is seen as the site for testing northern theories, boundary conditions, right? Including some of the calls that I mentioned, versus spaces for really being, a theory itself. And I think this is very visible in this universalization of some frameworks and ideas in the very maps we use, right? So that's why I had the inverted map, which is arbitrary to think that the north is in the north, the south is the south, but because it's, Earth is a globe in space, but we tend to normalize that convention, right? So I think this is, very visible into that. And examples that we see that in research, I have a couple of examples here. One is that by making, for example, institutions as universal, taking some that are particular and peculiar as the only one, then what happens is that you go around the world and see, well, when it doesn't conform with the North, they are just voids, they are no institutions, which has been a concept widely criticized, I think, especially in our field. But if you go on a Google Scholar, like I did this morning, you still find more than 80,000 results for that. And they're still publishing, right? So, I did a search also for like last year, and there's still a lot of papers coming out with this idea that basically assume that, okay, so it's not, if the the law or the private practice regulations, whatever it is not like in some places in the global north. They're just avoid, right? It's just absence. Or what also we see sometimes is that when we do engage with the reality of the global south, we may over-specify that. So when we talk about bureaucracy or entrepreneurship in Africa or America, we say, oh, that's African entrepreneurship. And when we say entrepreneurship in general, we just mean entrepreneurship in the global north, right? And there is great large-scale research that shows that this is found across fields, across areas, across time. So there's great work by Andres Torres and Diego Albores Gutierrez, in which they show across a large data set of papers that when the paper is drawing on data and ideas about the global north, they simply don't say anything geographically, versus when they're talking about Colombia, Brazil, Kenya, Ghana, India, China, whatever, they say something like, Chinese bureaucracy, Chinese, approaches and whatever, right? So there's a clear pattern on that. So, but I said that I want to name and specify the problems, but I also think about ways to address them. So the idea that we have come up with is this idea of particularizing, which works in two ways. That is, one is about recognizing the plurality in the context in the global south, while also identifying the specificities embedded in universalized frameworks. So I told the story about the Webers, Marianne and Max, right, that have thought about bureaucracy. It means that, for example, it was the experience of a colleague of mine that studies public administration in Mexico, which is very different from the conceptualization of Weber, because in that case, historically, the career systems were very different, was not as stable in other places. Now, after new presidents, from what I understand, there will be a lot of churn. Is to think that, well, that is a different type of bureaucracy, right? And the Weberian is one type, it's not the only one, right? Or in the case of my colleague Anna Kim, who has done research with tea farmers in Kenya, is to think that, we, the big we, right, including scholars, put a lot of value on written things and written communication and being written literate. But in some communities and places, they may be visually literate in how they communicate, share knowledge, and produce knowledge, and so on, which inspired her to, for example, collect data by using drawings, right? So recognizing the ways in which knowledge can be shared that is different, and then adjusting our methods to that in this case, or recognizing that some frameworks like bureaucracy is also specific for a particular space and time and its limits vis-a-vis other situations. And in these ideas, we're drawing a lot on the thought about Anushan Prasad, which is also the topic of another episode in which we go into more detail what particularization mean and how he talks about that and so on. And since I wanted to, use as much as I can maps because I think they're so tangible. So I also have an example of this, what this idea mean of moving from universalization to particularization. I just have a general one that is the more traditional one from the time of, discovery, so to speak, or invasions and expeditions, versus one that is inspired, that was created by the Aztecs, right? That has a different kind of symbol system, ways of representing, and so on, to just remind us, right, that there's different ways to represent and think about the world around us. So that's, I think, the idea here. Okay, so that was the first pair. The second pair is cultural superiority and symmetrizing. And I think this one is a bit more even immediate because, in a way, it is around so many debates beyond social sciences. But the idea of cultural superiority that we see here is that it's about positioning the northern perspectives as inherently superior, that tend to reinforce stereotypes about the South as problematic, backward, uncivilized, and erasing often the complicity of the North in these processes. And again, it is rooted in colonial epistemic hierarchies from early social science, like I mentioned, the one that has been studied by Rowan Connell, represented here on top left, which has cast the metropolis as the civilized and the colonized as the primitive, right? And we see in all kinds of depictions of the North as the savior and the South as needing rescue, like in debates about financial aid and world development and so on. And I think that in a way colors the way we engage with or not engage with local scholarship, right? The Global South, for example. We are drawing here also on ideas by David Aurelano Gold from Mexico that has looked at this in particular in the case of the public sector, right? Could be understood also, I think we debated about this term because it's in a way similar to ethnocentrism, right? But we want to think more in terms of the idea of beyond that, right? And how it's a cultural dimension to this. And again, I think that we see this very immediately. I just went on Google and wrote Global South and Global North, and the images on the left are the ones that came out, right? Which I think really show this kind of, assumed hierarchy very clearly. But I also wanted to give an example that is more historic to show how this has a long, shadow. This is a game that's called the Game of the World. That was a game, if I understand correctly, created in France, in which, no surprise, France is the center of the world and all of the colonies are around it. And basically, as further you go from the center, the idea is that they are less civilized and so on. And the whole point is to get to the center, right? So I think, again, this has a long story, which I think translating research in things like, for example, thinking that studying organizations or thinking that collectives in some places, like in Africa, cannot even be called organizations. And this is widely, well explained in this paper here by Joelle Cruz, in which she talks exactly about how her own experience in studying the state in Africa, she found comments by colleagues saying things like, how is your work even organizational if it's not just the research on a failed state? The idea being that, the Africa state in a particular country would be just, not really worth of being called even an organization, right? Which I think reflects such idea of superiority. Or also the many rankings that we see about corruption or quality of administration that tends to put the South as more corrupt or not as, qualified in terms of state capacity and so on. And so one, it creates and reinforces these hierarchical ideas, right? And again, because we want to see, okay, what to do then, we have been thinking about the idea of symmetrizing, which is about valuing local lived experiences and epistemologies by questioning the implicit hierarchies that privilege phenomena and ways of knowing related to the global north, right? And assuming them to be more advanced. We are drawing on some of the thought by Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, who is a Brazilian anthropologist. And I have one example here that I think is very compelling, that is by Erin McDonough, who is a sociologist. And she has this great work that she has studied state capacity around the world, and in particular in the global south. And she says a couple of things. She says, first, if you run the numbers and you compare state capacity or corruption between different agencies in the same nation, so two departments, two public agencies in Brazil or Ghana, where she did a lot of her field work, the distance within the state is as big as if you compare different states like Switzerland and Ghana, right? So she basically says that the problem of those maps is that they really don't tell the story, because in whatever you are, Switzerland or Ghana, there is a huge variation across different departments, right? And she shows exactly that empirically. And then she does even more, which I think that's even more compelling, because she then goes and studied some virtuous agencies in the public administration in Ghana, and she shows some of the characteristics that organizationally make them thrive. And she shows that in a way they often subvert many of the characteristics theorized by the Webers, right, in terms of how the career structure is set up and formalization and so on and so forth, which says basically there can be structural equivalents for effective, goal-oriented, impartial administration, right, in different places and time, right? So I think that it comes from, I think it's a great example of what we're trying to say here, what it means to start differently. And to, again, think of this in terms of maps. I'm sure that we are familiar with the so-called Mercator projection, which is the one in green. And we know that since Earth is a globe, any kind of projection is a choice on how to represent, and there are always some kind of distortions that take place. The Mercator was widely used originally because it was good for navigation, but it has the problem of overextending, the land size is not really truth to life, and makes in particular the North looks much bigger than actually it is, right? And there are other projections like the one by Gall Pictures that kind of, show the more actual size of the countries. And the point is that, of course, each framework and idea has its own choices. Some of them reinforces some ideas we have in terms of stereotypes and advancement and whatever, and maybe can find ways that others that can, alter that and allow us to think and see things differently. Okay, so that is the second pair. The third pair is exoticism and contextualizing. Again, I think that this is maybe the most immediate one. I'm sure that we have, come up with come against the term of exoticism. And here I'm drawing of the work on people like Stellan Como, Rafael Cadipani, Ralph Hartman. And we are basically generally defining exoticism here as portraying the global South experiences as unusual or fascinating, while stripping places and people from historical, political, and social context, right? Which reflects colonial tropes like the noble savage or the mysterious East. So maybe unlike cultural superiority that has a more negative view about the global South phenomena or theories, this is a bit more positive, but usually romanticized and idealized, right? Which I think leads people to theorize without considering variation and context. And a very visual, immediate, I think, example of this is of what is called the Mexican filter. If you Google that, to see many examples, it's basically like many movies that represent Mexico. I don't say Latin America in general, but also, Middle East countries, they have this sepia, overexposed kind of way of depicting just to create this kind of sense of wild and different, right? Which of course, you can visually see because it's how they trying to see in this kind of, exoticized way, right? Which for researchers like us, I think at least, there are many other implications, but we just have two examples here for reasons of time. One is that it leads people to choose topics and settings that maybe represent some of these romantic, overexposed, stereotypical ideas. So if one would study Brazil, for example, one would maybe traditionally think about favelas, right? But what many people don't think about, and it's a equally worthy topic, happened to be the one I studied for my PhD, is this big organization, which is Embraer, which is the third aircraft manufacturer in the world, right? That I'm sure many people have flown in one of them around the world because they literally sell everywhere. But people are not familiar with that, right? So this idea being that we tend to choose more sensationalized topics or choose topics that we see as naturally fitting for some places, like poverty in Brazil versus poverty in Switzerland, or complex engineering in Silicon Valley, but not complex engineering in Brazil, right? So that's, I think, the idea here. And the other one is, even if people see and have, again, a lot of this comes from a positive interest, are interesting, for example, ideas and concepts in Africa, still see them in a very romanticized, decontextualized manner, like the idea that I'm sure many people are familiar with of Ubuntu, right? I am because we are, and so on, which is a particular philosophy of a particular, some places in Africa that they are expected, they are seen to be from the whole continent, across everyone, in all situations, as if there is this homogeneous thing. Both Stellan Como and Ralph with colleagues talk very well about this in these papers and showcase that even African researchers themselves end up sometimes reproducing this idea that Ubuntu is this like African level thing that is all the same, that just kind of mystically just exists, right? Which of course flattens and decomplexifies the real reality. And the whole point is, we think that by contextualizing, foregrounding the heterogeneity of experiences and settings, put in a historical context, right? We can foreground the ways in which something like Ubuntu is interpreted, contested, adapted, right? Or we may start thinking about topics that have the different side of the coin, so to speak, right? So a lot of people, when they think about Mexico and the West, think about the border and how immigrants try to climb the wall and illegally immigrate and so on. But I think that many people don't realize that there's a lot of migration from the US citizens to the through Mexico for healthcare reasons, right? There's another kind of crossing that is not really debated because the more sectionalized one is the one of people from the south to north moving. And in here we are drawing on the ideas of Julian Go and Gurmida Bambra. Gurmida in particular has done great historical sociological work in showing that things like modernity is a global phenomenon, not just something that happened in an island in England, but is related to a whole span of trades and so on, right? So I think that's what we are trying to think here. And visually, I think the idea that I had as a map is that there are the maps of the colonizers, explorers, and so on, with all of these very idealized ideas, but trying to make more bottom-up ones. And here I have the example of just one, an artist called Dennis Wood, that he does all of these kind of maps of his neighborhood in North Carolina that are bottom-up maps of different things that he finds in a neighborhood, like the different street lights or mailboxes or the infrastructure of, sewage systems, right? To understand from the bottom up, from the lived experience, and the layers that exist around something. Okay, so I thought that I would try to distill from all that I told you something that is closer to what you particularly excited with, which are practices, right? So I have three things that you heard probably in my talk already. I'm going to pull it out a little bit, right? Which are three things that it's not an answer or a solution in any way. I think it's more about where do we look at in terms of concrete sayings and doings, right? One, I think that all of this that I'm saying to you means that we need to think more carefully about how we read and how we cite, right? And reading in terms of how much we read the local authors, reading in terms of how it allows us to immerse ourselves. Of course, reading also comes to mind the importance of knowing the language of the place, right? That you're theorizing and understanding the context and the origins of some ideas. So what has been written locally about a particular phenomena one is theorizing about, right? And I have this image that I like from a painter, Karl Hamut, that I like because he shows that there are the books and there are the trees, and how the trees and the furniture, you can see the history behind, what is related to furniture. I think it's a very poetic way to think about context and history. The other one is about doubting and questioning. I think especially when I was talking about particularizing, going beyond stereotypes that are encoded in our frameworks and ideas. So not just doubt and questioning as we are developing new theory, which we know that is important, and always questioning, is that really what is happening, being skeptical about our own findings, but also being doubtful and questioning the limits, the existence, the applicability of the existing frameworks, right? So making doubt generative in that way. And third, the very labels we use as we write, right? Both the labels that we use for existing theories or for the new concepts and theories that we create, as we talked about on how some concepts and ideas related to some geographic places tend to be more marked than others, right? Which means I think that brings in the importance of attention to labeling. And I think that, of course, it's also important to think about practice in their context and, the material conditions, the other things around them, the other practice that they intersect. And all of this, of course, is happening on a condition situation of publication practices and certain regimes and values and so on, that I think make people sometimes not read, not think enough about terms of doubting the existing frameworks or being careful about the labels, because there is this idea of, they just want to get the publication done, not so much thinking about the consequences of what one is writing, right? And I think to represent this, I feel that it's a little bit like going somewhere in the sightseeing type of buses, right? That you are really there, but you're not really engaged in understanding what is happening, which in some places, and this is true, there is some time even a thing called a favela safari in Rio, right? I think that is the kind of same idea, right? As trying to, understand, not really exoticize and see it in these very colored lenses, right? Which I end, and that's my final slide, with some kind of a reflection, because I recognize that all of this is conditioned by all of these other practices, but I think it's up to us, and I think Fabrizio was already saying that, because you can tell that I believe in an alternative, which is creating space for craft, for collectivity, for resisting this logic and trying to value the process in itself and instill different values and norms in our actual doing, right? So thinking about how our own practices maintain or not some regimes. And I am a member of the Ethnography Atelier, which has this charter of some of these values about how we think research can be done in a way that is more, for the lack of a better term, slow science-like, right? And so that is just something that I think that's important in order as a precondition to some of the things that I shared. So with that, I look forward to our Q&A. And thank you.
Thank you, Pedro, for your presentation. Very insightful, as I told everyone. It's always taking us from our chairs. So the floor is open. Feel free for. I have one question though, if I might, just to start a little bit to warm up everyone. And I also invite the professors and the mentors to jump in as well. Oh, Pedro, my question is just taken from the final talk is how can we handle situations where local epistemologies challenge Western theoretical categories, as you told, at a fundamental level? How can we extract more from our local epistemologies?
I mean, I have to say that I don't have an answer to a lot of these things, right? This is a lot of aspirational talk, but I have a friend who recently reminded me, right? Isn't that what social science or science is about? Disagreement and debates in a respectful way, and trying to articulate one's differences and positions and so on. So, I mean, we all know that Marx and Weber have different ideas about modernity, right? And they were articulated, and there's people that follow different ones, and they debate and so on. Why couldn't be a different one towards both of them, right? Of course, the problem is that, as I said, in publications, there's some editors have particular ideas, and there is kind of, there's power always integrated into knowledge, right? So challenging, as you were saying, also challenging maybe people's not just beliefs in the science in itself or the value of the idea, but also the material conditions around that exist. But I think that if we just stay close to the scientific model itself, it should just be natural to continue, right? So I think just keep pushing on that. That's my idea. But if anyone has a better idea, I'm happy to hear.
Thanks. I think Heiko has a question.
Hi, Pedro. First of all, this was super insightful. And I'll preface. No, I'll ask the question first, and then I'll preface it, postface it, as it were. So, I wanted to ask you about your experiences with reviewers, because the 3 points that you mentioned, there are some of them which are inbuilt into our model of science, as it were, in my perspective. So, think of cumulative knowledge accumulation. Right, we're trying to kind of join a conversation or whatever you want to call it. And that means that the person who got there first gets to call it bureaucracy. And when you find something which is not quite bureaucracy, you have to give it an adjective, if you will, right? Because you're kind of latecomer to the global knowledge production, right? So there's this, we then have this need to over-specify and explain and justify. And in a certain sense, the burden of explanation and proof is on scholars from what we now call the Global South, right? And on top of that, there's this burden of change. So on top of that, we also ask to revise and kind of change how we engage with the scholarship, and again kind of do slow scholarship, etc. But there's sometimes a personal cost inherent in that, right? In not playing the game according to the rules already established. So you've got this double burden of risk of explanation and of change. And I always wondered to what degree it's actually more ethical or fair to do this from the Global South, right? On the one hand, we get it, right? We have this understanding, but this is why I was asking you for your personal experiences with reviewers, because yes, we've been talking about this a couple of times as well. I think last year we had a couple of discussions, but I'd love to hear your own experiences related to that.
So some of the conversation with Anna started that I never had this big of a problem because when you study engineers making planes, people never even think that they are in Brazil, right? It was the opposite, is that everyone thinks that what I studied was in France, right? Everyone thinks like, oh, you studied Airbus. And it was like, no, they make planes in many other places. But then I spoke with Anna, and she said that she had a lot of challenges in convincing people that tea farmers in Kenya, right, there was management happening there, which is right in running the plantations and all of these, and allocating shifts and whatever, right, all of the administrative process that we are familiar with. So then we started talking about this, right? That exactly it's interesting that some of these things are more or less coded as being the global south or north, and some of times you get a pass or not. So I think there's a little bit about what you studied and what you're theorizing and so on. So my personal experience, besides the people that when I said I was going to study in Brazil or do fieldwork in Brazil were a bit skeptical, but when I usually present my work, people find that it's kind of, geographic-less, right? Given the nature of the topic, which I think is a find in itself, right? Because it's like there's knowledge work in many places, or there's complex technical work in many places. But it is a challenge. But I didn't invent any of this. I think that a lot of what I said could be said about what the feminists did, what the Black movement did, right? I'm a queer person, so what the queers did and do, both theoretically and on a daily basis, right? It's like you can even use humor, right? When someone asks you, so when did you come out? You can also say, so when did you come out as a straight person, right? Because the taken for granted has is that if you are different, you have to explain yourself. I mean, again, the feminists have done decades of this thing and of course brushed against, I think, challenges, but it is a position that there is a higher cost for sure, but I think that the point is not to do this alone, right? So that I was talking about craft and ethos and collective, because if you do as a woman, as a gay person, as a Black person by yourself is one thing. I think trying to do it collectively is where hope lies, I think. Now, on this whole thing about, the person that got there first got to call it, and then everyone has to exactly articulate the difference. That is true, right? But I think that going back to what I was talking with Fabricio, I think that is part of science, right? It's about making finer distinctions, and that is just what we are supposed to be doing. So I read Weber, and I think it's great, but that is a Weberian conceptualization. It's not necessarily the last one or the only one. And I think that any person who creates a conceptualization, because it is not dogma, right? It's science. We are all open to what can be discovered and show. And I think that is the beauty of the process. I think that maybe we just need to collectively remind reviewers more about this, right? And try to find ways, either if it's humor or through collective engagement, that showcases make this tangible. So I think, again, that's where my energy and hope goes to.
Thank you again,
Sil-
Pedro. I think Silvia.
Yes. Well, I really want to thank Pedro for this wonderful talk, and because it resonated with me so deeply, and I want to join your line of reasoning with a little comment from a feminist positioning and from feminist philosophies. Because while you were talking, I was thinking how powerful is the concept of a situatedness. So when you think about Donna Haraway and her comment, her critiques to the God trick, the idea of producing knowledge standing outside of the world and looking down there to the world and down there and outside, no? And proposing a way of producing knowledge that was situated. And when we say the situatedness, and in a while I will go back to practice theory and situated practice and situatedness, but first of all, looking from a situated position, so for something that is against the God trick, meaning being there, producing knowledge as being part of the world and not outside of that. And this is already so powerful in terms of being critical about our own knowledge production practices. And then when we go back to practice theory, that in one way or another it was is what brings us here together. The idea of practice theory not as a universalized practice theory, because goes towards what you have said, Pedro, so clearly and so precisely. But practice theory, to study practices that are situated. So the concept of situatedness in study practices mean exactly what you said in terms of particularizing, symmetrizing, contextualizing, so that what you study is are practices that are historically meaning also from a subject that is a racialized subject, a sexualized subject, and so on. So I think that we have to, if we want to think in terms of practice theories, bringing a critical view of practice theory means that we assume seriously the concept of situatedness and looking at our knowledge production practices in producing knowledge. So thank you so much for your talk, that I really enjoy. It resonates a lot with me and with what I do, but it was also really enjoyable. So thanks for this present for my birthday, Pedro.
Thank you so much. I was just going to say that I mean, fully, right? I originally wanted to be a gender scholar, so I think that's why a lot of this inspires me still today. But I think that some of the weapons of the minorities apply, right? To go back of what I was talking to Heiko, right? Of the humor. So I will give one example. I found it was very interesting that in one of the newsletters that the editor-in-chief of Org Science that he sent to reviewers, right? He was reminding people that, well, why do we ask how is this generalizable when there's a study about China? And he was saying maybe it generalizes to China, which has 1 billion people, right? So I was trying to poke fun at this idea that, well, generalized means generalizable to the US or generalizable to a large population. Well, if you're talking about 1 billion people, I think that's quite big, right? So I think a little bit of the ways in which all that try to, as the feminists have done, to showcase a different way and the situatedness, which is, I think, a great key to read all of this, right? I think these are some of the tactics, right, to make change happen.
Okay, just taking from the YouTube. We have no questions over there. Just the one that's interacting in that YouTube, just saying the excellent lecture and the applause, Pedro. So now I'm gonna ask Eduardo to jump in. Please, Eduardo.
Thank you, Fabrizio. Thank you, Pedro, for your talk. I would ask, where you are positioning the language or the barriers of language in this kind of how we do inquiry and how we publish, because for instance I know that many of the students in the room are not worried to present their papers but are worried of the English that they need to use to present their papers. So it's being somehow I'm doing these clinics. I have many students saying, oh, Eduardo, I have problems with my English. It's not as good as it should be, and overall, I think we are all not native English speakers, but we are all talking in English here. So, and also, I think the way we think in like um, Brazilian culture or our humor, it's different of um, uh, global North way of writing or of doing science. So, how this to summarize how you are positioning these barriers of language in the ways of doing this uh, the colonial research. Sorry for the mess, but I think it's somehow understandable.
Yes, I understand. And I was going to say that, I'm Brazilian, so I understand Portuguese. And like all Brazilians, I also think I understand Spanish, right? So, if you have any questions or comments in either language, it's fine as well. If I were to critique my own presentation, I would say there is not a lot of Brazilian authors, right? So I was going just to say that in languages also it colors what we cite because that's what we find when we go on Google Scholar. And I work in a place that is English speaking, so that colors my own practices on how I search for knowledge and so on. I would also say to two things. One is my political position is that English is not owned by a nation, right? I didn't come up with this. I think Gayatri Spivak talks a lot about this, and I remember that a friend saw her in a presentation, and the person said, "Oh no, I'm sorry because I'm not a native speaker." And then she corrected and said, "Well, I don't think you have to say that because English is not your language because it's not just the language of some people." And so I think there is also this stance that different accents, ways of talking are part of a language that has become a hegemonic language, right? Which also means that, things go both ways, right? There's the whole expansion, but also means that the whole change. So I think that is just a political position that I have that we should not think like that. Having said that, because I study expertise, we know that the markers of expertise colors the content. So how one talks or how one dresses, the gender of a person, on and on, the race and all, and so on and on and on, shapes. But I think that the effort of science, right, if we just stick close to this idea that knowledge production that has some ideals is to go beyond race and gender and work on the ideas, right? So political position, this idea that I recognize the challenge, but I also think that to some extent, some of the current tools, I cannot do anything without Grammarly nowadays, right? And I think that when I started using such tools that help with the writing, because I can never get the prepositions right, but I don't need to think about that anymore because Grammarly get the prepositions. I think some of this the barrier to some extent has been reduced, right? Especially in writing, because I think that's one of the good things about this popularization of some of these technologies. That it becomes easier to write in English. I think there's also, of course, the performance in talking and presenting one's idea, but I think it's a matter of practice, right? The more you exercise and do it and do with people and feel more confident, I think that also can change. Having said that, I think a lot of our effort should always be to try to get to the idea beyond the performance, right? So I think as a reviewer, as a listener, I think that's the challenge that we all have to remember.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Let me just jump in again, Pedro, because when you talk about inverting the map, what is actually being inverted? The methods, the concepts, or the politics of knowledge? Just like you taking what you already said.
So I think that in recognizing what has been done before, Anna and I think that people have talked plenty about the politics of knowledge and the concepts, right? Again, the work of Anshush Prasad and Ibarra Colado and many of the feminists, Rowan Connell, who is a feminist and the colonial thought thinker, right? I think they have covered all of this kind of better than I and Anna can ever do. I think that a lot of our effort, it was not as present in the presentation because I wanted to try to paint the whole picture, is in the level of the methods, right? In the level of our practice of doing research on how do we go and how do we collect the data, which techniques we choose, what topics do we choose, how do we aggregate ideas about them, how do we use or not use existing literature on that, how do we write it and write in a way that we label that and put relationships between concepts. So it's our own doing, because it's of course true that there is all of this political around it and concepts, but also I wanted to think, so then what can we do, right, as we are doing this work? And this we, in a way, were implicitly writing as if it was people from the north coming to the south, but it's also people from the south studying the south, because I can be, as guilty or as vulnerable to any of these problems as I think anyone else, right? So that's why we wanted to think in terms of stuff that we can do at the level of methods, because I think that is where the literature has not distilled concrete questions you should ask yourself, for example, as you're doing the research, right? So I think that is what we wanted to give and trying to give more on, which again, a lot of this has been said, as Sylvia said, it's like basically making practice theory to apply to ourselves. We're just trying to articulate that in relation to this and to try to get to the level of the very methods as concrete as possible.
Thanks. I'm just thinking about how can we be truly symmetrical when academic publishing is still dominated by the global north expectations. That's why I don't mind asking.
Yeah.
Sylvia, please jump in.
Thank you. So if we can go into more in a conversation mode, I want to put some doubts about the image of inverting the map. How good is this image? Because inverting, has the risk of putting the north versus the south, so to bring us in an either or mode of thinking. So this can be a limit. At the same time, I want to say that it is a good metaphor if you think about taking, for example, a concept and putting it upside down, to play with the concept, to revert then. And then I want to give another suggestion that maybe instead of inverting the map, could be a good image, the feminist concept of diffraction. So a diffractive view of the north seen through the eyes of the south and vice versa. So how can we look differently and see differently if we just diffract one concept through another, one idea through another, so that we can start thinking, and this is the lesson for me from queer theory, we can think in terms of either or, but we can think in terms of both and we can think in terms of neither nor. And the discussion that we had about the language is a good example, because you can say English became hegemonic. Okay, so that we are, so to say, colonized by English language. But also you can look at how our appropriation of English has changed the language, so that the English that now is acceptable English is an English with all our accent, with words that are invented, and so on, and more. So we also, there is, so to say, a contra-colonizing on the language. Also in the journal now, the language is much more accepted, and also technology comes in also in appropriating the language, and so on. So I think that is a good way also of looking at concept and phenomena through either both and, but also neither nor. So in a sense, the English that we use is neither British English and is nor something completely different. So there are forms of diffraction, hybridization, and I think this was how I understood Pedro invitation to hybridize or symmetrize, something like that.
Yes.
Thank you.
No, thank you. I'll just say one thing. I know that I sit in a particular situated position, right? That I work in the global north and so on and so forth. But I do believe, like anyone that ever want to change, that things are possible, right? And I do believe that, in a way, the world is economically changing, right? Which always gives us a tip that sure, the US and Europe still has an economic force in cultural and political and economic, but China is a great example, or even Latin America, on how things are being redrawn, to use what Heiko was suggesting, right? Which I think is also what is at the root in part of this interest of some people at the metropole, right? In the journals and editors, in having at least a curiosity to think beyond. And there are other shortcomings that I pointed out, but I think that is already a reflection there is something at pace, right? Because 20 years ago, I don't think we would have seen a call like this. So I think that is also something to put in context and consider, right? That yes, it's an uphill battle. It is maybe a struggle, like every form of change. But at the same time, I feel that I want to think at least that the winds are in our favor.
Mhm.
Yes, thank you very much, Silvia, Pedro. It was a very, very interesting lecture with so many comfortable and uncomfortable thoughts. Thank you very much for this. Now we have to say goodbye to our fellows in YouTube, because now we are going to have a break. And then we have the research clinics in breakout rooms, and this is closed to only the authors. So I would like to thank again to everybody here in the room and everybody in our fellows company on YouTube and the comments also. Now I'm going to stop the live stream. Please stay here in the room. Just a second.